Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 400 library systems across the US, Canada, and New Zealand with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with all of the amazing authors that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, I am so ecstatic to be here with New York Times bestselling author and National Book Award winner, Elizabeth Acevedo, as she talks to us about the power of poetry. And she will be back, I'm sure. I will finish the introduction and her writing in general. So I know that everyone is ready to get started, but before we begin, let me pause for one moment and kind of give you all that standard housekeeping information that keeps everything running smoothly. We have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but you may also submit questions during the talk by clicking that questions button that's just below the live stream video. Keep in mind, there are a lot of you tuning in today, so we will get to as many questions as time allows. And don't worry, if you have to leave early, welcome back, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
If you have to leave
I'm so sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Hey, this is why I have a long-winded introduction in case anything goes wrong. There will be a recording that's sent out to everybody that registered via email in about 24 hours. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today. Elizabeth Acevedo is the New York Times bestselling author of The Poet X, which won the National Book Award for Young People's Literature, among many other awards. She's also the author of numerous other titles, including Family Lore, With the Fire on High, and Clap When You Land. She is a National Poetry Slam champion and resides in Washington, D.C. with her husband. Again, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. How are you today?
I'm all right. Happy to be here with you.
We're so happy to have you. So we have tons of questions about being a slam poetry champion. So I love that it's in your bio because people were super excited to hear about that. But I think that Bill's question kind of encompasses the many questions. So I'm going to start with Bill's question from Hayward Public Library. What was your experience like at your first poetry slam? Did you get to pick the venue? Did the judges give you feedback? And are you still competing?
Oof. I began doing poetry slams when I was 14 years old. I was in my first year in high school, and I had a teacher who encouraged me to participate. And I didn't really know what that was. I knew what performance poetry was. I had been reciting poetry, but I hadn't realized that there was a form of competition. I'm incredibly competitive, and so it was kind of perfect for me. I did get to sign up for the venue that had preliminary rounds. So in New York City, 500 teenagers were competing that year to be the top 5 students who would represent New York at the Brave New Voices International Poetry Festival. And, that was the venue I chose, was the New York Poets Cafe, which is a pretty famous venue in New York. And I went there on a Saturday. The slams were from 1 to 4 p.m. I don't know why I remember that. And my best friend went with me, and I was so nervous. And I just remember her being like, here's a stick of gum, like, here's some deodorant, like, go get yourself together. Like, she was like my coach before I had a coach. It was just like, gather yourself, girl. And I did I didn't have poems at the time. I considered myself a rapper. And so I did a rap song a cappella. And that was my submission. Wow. And I kind of raced through it and sat down and put my head down and tried to hide, and ended up moving on to the next round. And so it was good information. More importantly, it was really good to listen to other people and realize, oh, there's a lot of styles and a lot of ways to approach this and a lot of ways to show up and write poems. And from that very first slam, it was like my brain opened up to all the possibilities of performance and poetry.
Would you say that that started your poetry writing journey? What started your writing, your journey to poetry? I guess Alice is asking, when and why did you fall in love with poetry?
Yeah, I mean, I think music, and especially hip hop, is a form of poetry, right? I was trying to do that same work. I was still writing really narrative um, rap lyrics, even though, I thought they were slightly different at this time. But I think joining the poetry club in my school and then participating in slams made me realize how many styles there were. And I didn't make the team that year. I wasn't one of the top five. I think I came in like seventh or eighth. I made it all the way to finals and just didn't move on. But it meant that I joined all the workshops. And so I did a full year of workshops before going back and competing. And the workshops were working on your own work, but it was also reading. And it was probably one of the first times where I spent concentrated hours talking to other people about poems and about what writers were trying to do. And I think I fell in love with like what felt kind of like secretive, not secretive, but like, oh, writers like embed all kinds of things in their language and in what they're trying to do. And my style was very straightforward, and I think I learned about like, oh, there's all these doorways, that you can build into a poem, um, and different ways to invite people in. And that's probably when I fell in love, was when I started doing the workshops.
Was there, other than your friend that you mentioned, who was kind of like your first coach, was there a mentor when you were a teenager that was encouraging you to start looking at poetry, and how did
Yeah,
that?
I mean, too many, right? Like I am charmed, and I lived a charmed young adult life when it came to just the number of adults who poured into me, right? And so I'm thinking here of the author, middle grade author Phil Bildner, who was my sixth and eighth grade language arts teacher. And, long before he had published anything, knew that I was a writer and encouraged me to keep reading and keep making. And to this day is still a mentor and someone that I talk to fairly consistently. In high school, there was a teacher named Abby Lublin who was the head of the Live Poet Society, and so she was the person who was like, in this club we say our poems out loud, and then we take the time and just sit with the words and like just savor them, and we encourage each other's. And that was every Tuesday. So every Tuesday we would show up in her classroom. And having been a teacher and having, a life outside of teaching, I just realized like that commitment to your young people to be like, I will hold this space for us because you have something you want to say. Right. And so I think that was really special. Mahogany Brown, who is also an author, she has a YA novel called Chlorine Sky, was a huge mentor in the poetry program that I was a part of, Urban Word. And so, I mean, I can go on and on, right? Like I really am so blessed that like I had access to as many teaching artists and poets and writers that I did, and that they all, were so encouraging. So, Brandon, I don't want to turn this hour into just like a list of gratitude, although I would be happy to.
I'm sure some other names will continue to come up throughout the conversation.
For sure, for sure, for sure.
So I've already heard you talk about kind of some parallels of your life and some parallels that we see with Xiomara in The Poet X. So can you tell us, give us a brief summary about The Poet X?
The Poet X is the story of Xiomara Batista, a 15-year-old Dominican American growing up in New York City, who's coming from a fairly conservative Catholic household. Her mom wanted to be a nun and still has very, strong ideas about what makes a proper young woman, and is, raising her daughter with these kinds of ideologies. And Xiomara is a poet, and she has this journal and she writes in it every single day and kind of chronicles her life, and is trying to figure out what it means to be someone who is inherently a fighter, and how to use her words and her language to expand her world, right? To make space for all the things she brings with her when she moves into a room.
Mm-hmm. And this novel was completely in verse, a novel in verse.
Yeah.
If you've transitioned, you did a novel in verse and then in prose and then in verse. So why a novel in verse? What spoke to you about the story that you thought this needs to be entirely in verse?
I was an eighth grade English language arts teacher, and I read a lot of books. I read all the books my young people were reading. I had an expansive library in my classroom. The school library was incredible as well. And so I was always in there asking, the media specialist for his recommendations and what was new and what was coming in. And so I really got kind of entrenched in the world of YA. And there were books that I thought were just, beyond wonderful. And there were books that I thought kind of, missed the mark. And so I became, I think, a really good critic of YA work. And as someone who had been writing poetry for most of my life, I realized that a lot of the novels in verse, I wasn't entirely sure if they were always written by people who had a strong foundation in poetry. There were just opportunities that I felt were missed in language. I think there were ways that it seemed like the authors underestimated what a young person could find in the language. And especially because I was a teen who wrote poetry, I think I was hypercritical of how people writing poetry towards teens assumed they could or couldn't do or say or think. And so the idea of like, oh, maybe that's possible kind of began there. But I really didn't think I would ever write a novel. I mean, I performed for my students and that felt like enough. And then I got the sense that it really wasn't, that they couldn't carry the poems with them, right? Like, unless I was in front of them, they couldn't hold them. And the teacher I mentioned before, Phil Bildner, who at that point was with a literary agency, reached out and said that one of the agents was looking for new clients and wanted someone specifically with a more lyric voice. And did I have anything? And I'm like, well, no, because I don't write books, right? But that little idea of, okay, maybe there's something there. And I had a student named Catherine Bolaños who just really struggled with reading and was looking for something for her, and was kind of like, none of these books that we have on our shelves are about us. And I had a diverse shelf, but she just wanted more. She didn't feel like there was enough. And so I think like these two things happen at the same time, where someone is like, hey, if you have something to send, I have someone who might want to look at it. And I have a student who's kind of like, I wish we had more books that spoke to us in this way. And that moment of, well, why not me? Right. And I started the Poet X and realized I didn't know how to write fiction. And so I had to write 2 other novels in prose and just teach myself what it means to write a book.
Wow.
And then I went back to the Poet X and was able to complete that because I kind of had a sense then of like holding a narrative. That was a long ass answer, Brandon, for what was not a very
okay.
long question.
Listen, people are here to hear about you. So the answer is fantastic.
Yeah. I think whether it's verse or prose or an Instagram caption, I like to think about it as the writing is a form, as a container, right? And so you just think about the story. What's the best container for this story? And so with The Fire on High, could not have been in verse because the cast was too large and she was traveling to Spain and there was all this food. It would have felt like trying to contain way too much. I thought it would get muddy. There was more dialogue. I knew the voice wanted to speak out more, right? I think verse really lends itself to interiority. It lends itself to characters that are in their heads, and the majority of their conflict has to do with, how do I get from thinking of myself in this way, in a small way, to a bigger way? And so the poetry can respond to that. So I'm just always thinking of like, what's the best container? And I don't let myself get too bogged down, right, by, oh, it has to be verse now, or this one is going to be pro. I don't make that decision until I know the story, and then I'm like, what's going to hold it?
That was a wonderful answer. Thank you.
Thank you. I got there eventually, right?
So your stories all seem to touch on kind of similar themes. There are threaded themes throughout, and even the Poet X, like themes of body image and sexuality, and even femininity and family struggles, intersectional issues. Did you find it difficult to approach these kinds of topics when writing them? Were you ever second guessing like how much you should say? And was the difficulty level, Aaron wants to know, was the difficulty level, or was it easier or more difficult in prose than it was in poetry in approaching these topics?
I think I wanted a young person picking up these books to feel like the author was telling the truth about what young people go through.
Mhm.
and what they encounter. And that doesn't mean that young people only go through hardships, right? Or difficulties, but I think, but it is a part of what they know, right? And there's a way to be unflinchingly honest and tender. And to me, that's the approach of, when I think specifically that I was writing for the school and the students at the school where I taught at, and I was writing for a younger me who had hoped to see these books on a shelf. There were things that we went through. I'm thinking of myself, my best friend, my cousins. There were things that my students were then going through years later, and it astounded me, some of the things my students would tell me that was happening in their families or their communities or in the school that teachers didn't know about, and how much it echoed. Oh, well, yeah, I went through that same thing in eighth grade, right? In ninth grade and 10th grade. And so it's like, what's happening that it's a cyclical nature. And so it felt important to me to just approach the topics head on, to kind of do the job of naming. If we all think we're the only ones going through these things, there's a loneliness there. And what is a book if not a way to feel less lonely? And so I wanted to look at the subjects. I wanted to name what happens when your father is an absent father, but he's present, but he's just not involved. What happens when you love your mother, but you don't like her and you don't think she likes you? Like, just really naming the situations and saying, like, let's look at all of it. Let's put language to all of it. And like, let's recognize that this is not a like just one person's experience, right? That this is systemic. This is,
Mhm.
and it's been happening for a long time. And without us looking at it and realizing there are other ways forward, we won't move forward. And so um it just feels critical to me to write the world I know and the community I know and the young people I know, and give a lot of dignity and joy, right? Because some of these subjects can be really hard, and then it's like these really heavy books that don't show young women of color having any type of joy. And it felt really important to me that there's always hope, and there's joy, and there's laughter, and there's cat memes, and like, this is also a part of the world.
Anytime that you can manage to write in a cat meme is good by me.
Right, right, right.
um, Catherine is saying the way that you, and kind of just on the same subject here, the way that you capture what it's like to be a young woman, a teenager who's growing into their own body, and people are starting to take notice, is so relatable to so many. We don't have a lot of control over how others treat us because of what they see. And lines like, when your body takes up more room than your voice, really get to the heart of capturing this. Can you
Yeah.
talk more about this idea that you should just love any attention that you get without saying anything, and why books and reading are important to combating that?
Oh, um,
It's a big question, Catherine.
it is a big question. I remember going into this novel and gender and the way that gender is deployed and performed being one of the biggest questions I wanted to think about. And it's the primary reason that the main character ended up having a twin brother, because I wanted to show like these two siblings genetically, identical, of the same parents, and yet the expectations of them are different simply because of gender, and their whole lives are shaped by what they are allowed to do because of what their parents think is possible in their body or acceptable in their body. And I didn't know how I was going to see that through, right? But I knew that I grew up in a neighborhood where I was catcalled, and where I had to learn to defend myself, and then also reached an age where defending myself became really dangerous,
Mm,
right? Because it was no longer two 12-year-olds yelling at each other. And it was like, well, if we're both 17, or I'm 17 and you're 27,
right.
there is now a huge power difference and physical difference. And I had to learn, like, oh, in this moment I have to hold my tongue in order to remain safe. But what does that do to you? Right. And so the Poet X was really trying to think about what it does to remain silent. It is a book that I wrote with young women in mind, but that I am so thankful that young men read, right? And that folks who are, gender non-binary, and trying to figure out what parts of gender they want to perform, can find different ways in. Like, there's a lot of ways to show up for each other. And I think young men can see the ways that the things they say or the ways they let their friends say certain things, or when we stay silent, what that can do to someone that maybe they've never thought about or been in those shoes. And so it was a huge theme. It was really, really important to me to just have Xiomara be someone who becomes braver in her body, right? And she's hyper visible. She is someone who takes up a lot of space when it comes to how she moves, and in many ways also invisible. Very few people get to know, the secret parts of herself because she protects it. And so it was quite a lot to toggle. Um, but again, like thinking of my youth and then my young people, like, oh, but this is every day. Like these kinds of interactions around womanhood are happening, and young women aren't feeling safe in their bodies and in their neighborhoods and in their homes, and we have to write about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Jan from Chesterfield County Public Library says, hearing you read the audiobook version in your own voice adds immeasurably to the experience. So maybe this would be a good time for you to read for us a little bit and introduce us a little bit more to Xiomara.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. One of the projects I had when writing this book was I really wanted it to sound like the character I was imagining in my head, right? Someone who weaves Spanish and English and slang and poetry all throughout. And so I'm going to start with this section where Xiomara is describing herself. I am unhideable, taller than even my father, with what mommy has always said was a little too much body for such a young girl. I am the baby fat that settled into D cups and swinging hips, so that the boys who called me a whale in middle school now ask me to send them pictures of myself in a thong. The other girls call me conceited, ho, thought fast. When your body takes up more room than your voice, you are always the target of well-aimed rumors, which is why I let my knuckles talk for me, which is why I learned to shrug when my name was replaced by insults. I forced my skin just as thick as I am. Mira, muchacha is mommy's favorite way to start a sentence. And I know I've already done something wrong when she hits me with that. Look, girl. This time it's Mira, muchacha. Marina from across the street told me you were on the stoop again, talking to los vendedores. Like usual, I bite my tongue and don't correct her because I hadn't been talking to the drug dealers. They'd been talking to me. But she said she doesn't want any conversation between me and those boys or any boys at all. And she better not hear about me hanging out like a wet shirt on a clothesline, just waiting to be worn, or she would go ahead and be the one to wring my neck. Oíste? She asks, but walks away before I can answer. Sometimes I want to tell her the only person in this house who isn't heard is me. I'm the only one in the family without a biblical name. Shit, Xiomara isn't even Dominican. I know because I Googled it. It means one who is ready for war. And truth be told, that description is about right. Because I even tried to come into the world in a fighting stance. Feet first had to be cut out of mommy after she'd given birth to my twin brother Xavier just fine. And my name labors out of some people's mouths in that same awkward and painful way until I have to slowly say, Si o Mara. I've learned not to flinch the first day of school as teachers get stuck stupid trying to figure it out. Mommy says she thought it was a saint's name, gave me this gift of battle, and now curses how well I live up to it. My parents probably wanted a girl who would sit in the pews, wearing pretty florals and a soft smile. They got combat boots and a mouth silent until it's sharp as an island machete. Pero tú no eres fácil is a phrase I've heard my whole life. When I come home with my knuckles scraped up, pero tú no eres fácil. When I don't wash the dishes quickly enough or I forget to scrub the tub, pero tú no eres fácil. Sometimes it's a good thing when I do well on an exam or the rare time I get an award. Oh, pero tú no eres fácil. When my mother's pregnancy was difficult, And it was all because of me, because I was turned around and they thought that I would die, or worse, that I would kill her. So they held a prayer circle at church. And even Father Sean showed up at the emergency room. Father Sean, who held my mother's hand as she labored me into the world. And Papi paced behind the doctor, who said this was the most difficult birth she had ever been a part of. But instead of dying, I came out wailing, waving my tiny fist. And the first thing Papi said, the first words I ever heard, pero tú no eres fácil. You sure ain't. Thank you.
Thank you. That was incredible. That was incredible. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To finish Jan's question, Jan says, do you imagine how non-New York City raised print readers will access your beautiful nuances when you're writing? So that makes me also think of structure and looking at poetry, and those who maybe aren't familiar with reading poetry and the structural reading that takes place. So I want to share my screen. We look at this last line here of God, to be out there checking for me. That's those extra long spaces and the structural reading of poetry. Can you teach us a bit about that and how a novice poetry reader might go about understanding how to read these structural poems?
Yeah. I think to the initial point that Jan was making, I like to think that the best writing teaches you how to read it and teaches you how to fall into its cadence. I'm thinking here of Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, right, which begins with a very different approach to syntax and to punctuation that many people are unfamiliar with. And yet it teaches you how to fall into the voice, right? How to find Janie in that language. And so, you know, I remember reading that in high school and thinking, oh, there's a lot of ways in Junot Diaz's Oscar Wilde, which is very New York, very Dominican, very Jersey, right? And I think can make some people have that initial reaction of, oh, I don't know how to read it. But I think you surrender to the cadence. And so I guess I just trust that my readers will, you know, do the same kind of work that I've had to do for years in finding a way into language that feels unfamiliar, and then finding joy in like having to navigate that. And it is very much structured, right? Like you were saying, Brandon, it is, especially with verse, it is at play, because I think people who listen to the audio have my voice with them and they can, and that's helpful. But I think that people reading have a different kind of delight, which is like this page here we're looking at, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is the language doing? Why is it becoming a kind of ladder? What does it mean in terms of movement and in feeling like there's motion? I have moved away, right? So in a poem about God, I start here and then I'm taking these steps and then I'm back and I'm taking these steps. And it's also in terse sets. We know that the number 3 is pretty important. Those long gaps that you were talking about in the previous ones are called caesuras, and they're just like these big breath breaks. And so I imagine that if nothing else, what they do when a reader is reading is that they stop. They have to stop and think about, how am I engaging with this language? What is the page asking me to do here?
Mm-hmm.
And I love that. I love that it is constantly making the reader have to figure out make choices around what their involvement is with the text, because you could just read it straight through. You could allow it to be pauses. You could make it really long breath pauses. In some ways, it feels like I'm giving you a script for performance poetry. Like, here's the long breath, here's the long pause, right? Here's the break where the character can't speak through it. And so the page can't write through it, right? And so it feels like it's doing a lot of different kinds of work, and pushing us to be unfamiliar with language and to have to make decisions around how we want to receive the text. This is one of my favorite pieces, and I wrote it very early on when I figured out what this book was going to be about. And just like the poem being about ants, and then these like the one word on every line, like kind of feels like this little ant farm. except for the dialogue, right, which interrupts. It keeps interrupting, and it, I don't know, the whole page to me kind of looks like an ant farm, and has this funny movement, but it's also like the most traumatic, right? And so it's very structurally held. It's very tight, and there's chaos happening narratively, right? The characters being dragged to the altar and being forced to kind of pray the things she carries out of her by her mom, and yet it's just these tiny one words. And I think it was helpful for me because it slowed everything down, right?
The
It doesn't
imagery
let you,
of this one
mhm.
is insane, because the dragging and like the bowing, like the
Yeah,
words going down,
yeah.
it's beautiful.
Yeah. And I think that's something that verse really allows, right? That prose doesn't, is like, how do you make the page um illustrative of what's happening, right? What's actually happening inside the character, the emotions the character's feeling, but also structurally. Like, I would not have thought of this as a concrete poem, but in some ways it is a depiction of the bowing. It is a depiction of being dragged. It is a depiction of being forced to kneel. And so maybe it's an abstract concrete poem, but I love that verse gives you that space. There's a lot of page space, right?
Mhm.
And it's why I think young people, right? Like, I've gotten a lot of awards for writing for reluctant readers, which I didn't necessarily know I was doing. But I think the eye of a reader who maybe struggles does okay with the fact that there's a lot of page, that they can figure out that there's no right way to read it, right? They can add their own sauce to it, and it feels more open in that way.
Mhm. Well, that's beautiful. Thank you for walking us
Yeah.
through that. Okay. Oh,
I'm
and
very much a poetry nerd, so I'm always happy to discuss the craft choices that I've made around, what I wanted each poem to do and look like. And the book would have been even more wildly formatted. But then I realized that when you print, it has to be 4-inch margins. Like, you only have 4 inches of like text space. And
uh-huh.
so I remember submitting the draft and then getting it back, and they're like, all of this has to be cut. And so I
Oh,
had to rearrange like half the book in terms of format because I didn't realize I didn't have as much line space. Now I know. Now I only write in 4-inch margin.
you only write in four
Yeah,
words.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No. I'm just like, I have to know what it's gonna look like when it prints.
So we did get a lot of questions about kind of the writing process and even the editing, drafting, and publishing process. And Kate
Yeah.
from Holliston Public Library says, I'm always curious to hear poets' writing routines, their sources and process of inspiration, and the cycle of a poem's creation from seed to full bloom to finish. Can you tell us about it?
Oh, my writing process has changed a lot in the years. And so I will give you a little bit of the writing process for the Poet X. Um, I was a full-time touring poet. I did presentations throughout the entire country, a one-woman show, and I followed the school year. So I would mostly perform at high schools, colleges, nonprofit organizations. But so my work, right, traveling, was on the school schedule, which meant that when I wanted to write, I had to write in the summer. And so I had 3 months to finish a book. And then I would revise and edit in the winter. And that was kind of, so I got very used to um, these kind of spurts and like sprints of writing. And then knowing that I would come back when I had the next big break. And I think it was really helpful because in between the first draft and the revision, there was just a lot of thinking time and a lot of sitting with the characters, but I wasn't playing yet. And when I went back to revisions, I had just had, all these months of being saturated in the world and thinking about the world. And I think I came with a lot of maturity and distance. And that was how I wrote up until the pandemic, where I was no longer touring and then had to figure out a different rhythm. And I did a workshop once a week with two friends, the poet and novelist Safia Hillo and the historian and poet Clint Smith. And we would bring pages every week. And that was kind of how I wrote Family Lore.
Mm.
I had surgery, I got pregnant, and I kind of maintained that same routine of just writing a certain number of pages every single week until Family Lore was completed. None of those are currently working for me. And so the novel I'm working on now, I'm kind of just I do a 1 week retreat where I rent an office and I go for the week and I do 20,000 words. And then, I take 3 weeks off and then I go back and do another 20,000 words. And it's a different kind of sprint and it's really, really hard, but it means that, you know, every section of the book is getting my entirety being really in it. And we'll see how that goes, right? Like I don't know what that's gonna look like, but I'm someone who's very much a sprinter. I have to write fast and then edit slow in order to make something work for me. And writing every day hasn't been working, which is why I'm like write every day for 5 days and then take time to just think and ask questions and then do it again.
A few months ago, I talked with Xochitl Gonzalez, who actually said that
Yes.
she does something similar. Just kind of has to do the retreat. Nobody can get a hold of me. Nobody can talk to me.
Yeah, but you just have to, kind of lock in. And I will say that some of the people I was reading for the Poet X, I read all the big folks, the Sonia Sones, I read Sandra Cisneros' House on Mango Street again. Sandra is very much a poet, and I think that we don't call The House on Mango Street a novel in verse, but I think it is. It's prose poetry in many ways. I read Ellen Hopkins. Maybe I said that already. No, I said Sonia Sones, Ellen Hopkins, Sandra Cisneros, Jacqueline Woodson's Brown Girl Dreaming. And then I had a very early copy, just a manuscript that Jason Reynolds sent me of Long Way Down. And so I had like kind of a couple of different examples of novels in verse, and I went from there. But those were probably the master texts I was looking at.
Stephanie from Mentor Public Library, in this same vein, is wondering how much of your creative process is done out loud versus on the page, especially since you kind of started with slam poetry.
I read a lot out loud to myself. Rhythm is really important to me. Even in my prose work, I need the sentence to sound a certain way. Like there's sometimes I'll be writing, I'm like, oh, there's a beat missing. And it's just, I think I listen for iambic pentameter. I think a lot of us do. I think it's why there was that, a couple of years where every title was like the sword, the thud, and then the thud, because we like want the thud, like we want, our ear wants that.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I'll hear myself wanting that, and I have to think like, oh, does that work here? Or actually, should I break it because it's going to make the reader have to kind of be like, oh, what's wrong? Why did that land weird on my ear? And if it models the thinking on the page, then that's fun. It's fun to jostle someone and be like, are you paying attention? Like, are you here with me? Something is not in accord. And so I'm always listening because I think it's an added layer. So I have an entire revision where it's just reading the book. And because I do the audiobooks, that's like my last opportunity to do edits. So while I'm doing the audiobooks, I can kind of send in quick, like, oh, what about, can I change this word? Or I think we're missing this thing here. Or I actually want to remove this sentence. And so the hearing it out loud is a completely different way to write. And it's a part of the practice. Yeah.
Did you always plan to do your own audiobooks?
No, I had to audition.
Oh.
I remember reaching out to HarperCollins when the Poet X was coming out, and I was like, I'd really love to do the audiobook. Like, when would I get more information about that? I thought it was just like, and the audiobook director was like, well, we'd have to hear you and make sure it's the right fit. And I'm like, the right fit? Like, I wrote it, right? But of course, a lot of authors aren't good at reading their own work and aren't interested in reading their own work, right? They want the page to do what the page does and let a voice actor do it. But for me, it just felt like, but I'm a performer. And so the audiobook director came to an event I was doing and listened to me read the first 4 pages that you all just heard, and then emailed me after and was like, so we can start on this date. Like, here's what. And she and I ended up having an incredible, incredible relationship. We won audiobook awards together. We did some wonderful work. She left She left Harper, and I'm really sad. But my first three books were all with her, and I think you can tell. Very few people could direct me the way she could, and I love that she was kind of like the best person for the job, even if it's not you, right? And at the time, I was like, "Girl, what?" But
Could it not be me?
what are you talking about?
That's funny.
It's hilarious. now, right? The fact that I
Right.
was like, oh,
Not when you read it or had the phone call or whatever.
Right.
Melissa says, you've mentioned trust between an audience, reader, and the author. Why is that important to you? What role does that play in consumption of art?
I mean, I think that the very first contract, right, that we make with an author is like, I trust you to tell me a good story, and I trust you to like leave me somewhere I wasn't when I first arrived to the page, right? It's the earliest contract. And writers who break that trust, who either halfway through the book flip the world or flip the initial what you thought you were reading. It's like when you read a romance novel that's very much in the vein of a happy ending romance novel, and then it's not a happy ending, we feel offended, like that is not what I signed up for, right? And so I think that trust of, I signed up for a particular kind of story, and I'm okay being surprised, but it has to feel inevitable, right? And if that doesn't happen, I think we lose that. But for me specifically, because I think I'm writing often about and towards a demographic that isn't always respected in American letters, it feels really important to say, this book is going to be loving towards you, and it will be honest, and it's not a rose-colored glasses book, but it is a book that that ultimately sees your humanity and wants to celebrate it. And I think readers trusting that, you know, they won't get halfway through and see a stereotype that is just, you know, throwaway, or you know, like, I think that that's critical, right? That I'm always approaching the page really thoughtfully and intentionally.
I agree. Thank you for that answer. SD says, any advice for youth whose first language isn't English or are bilingual and want to get into writing poetry or anything else? And we actually have a ton of questions about advice on how to get the youth into poetry and writing and reading.
Yeah, I think that we should be encouraging young people to write in whatever language they feel most comfortable to write in. And what was important for me as a teaching artist, and as a poetry slam coach when I was coaching young people and as a teacher, is to divorce myself from feeling like I needed to provide a particular kind of feedback, or that I needed to help them make the piece better. And especially when we're talking about a different language, if I don't have access to that language, that's okay. I want to hear the music. I want to hear the rhythm. I want to hear the word choices and where the emphasis was. Like, there's so many ways in, right? And to honor that the language where you can express yourself the best is the language, right? And then if you want to do the work of translation, right, that is a whole other field of poetry. What does it mean to translate yourself and find the best word and find the most precise word, or maybe keep a word in the original language because there is no translation for that? And so I think giving young people those options of, the point is to get what you think and feel out, and everything else, the trappings of everything else, isn't about that, right? And I'm not going to grade it, and I'm not going to put pressure on it, and you don't have to read it if you don't want to. You can just tell me, you know, what came up for you, and that's enough. I think, you know, I've led entire workshops over the course of a semester where a young person never read their work and just kind of told me like, yeah, this came up for me, but it was still important for them. They kept coming, right? Like, whether or not someone else ever heard their work didn't matter. It was just that they knew that someone was interested in the fact that they were writing and making, and they were being, you know, handed tools that they could use and repurpose And so I think that, that's kind of helpful. And I'm really interested in writing prompts and writing exercises that just open up the kinds of questions that young people ask themselves. And so, particularly because I care a lot about body and how we move in the world in bodies. And I think young people really struggle with body comparisons and what their bodies aren't doing, how their bodies aren't looked at. Those are always ways in that can really move poetry. And so some of my favorite prompts are, think about the part of your body you like the least. Now write it a love letter. And then the flip side, the palette note on that, now have it write a love letter to you. And I think that that's kind of like a funky exercise because you have to really rethink what that means and why don't you love it and what would it say to you if it could talk to you. Like that kind of empathy practice towards yourself, I think does really important work. One of my favorite exercise is based on Natalie Diaz's poem, Why I Hate Raisins, which is all about like her relationship with her mom and having to eat, government issued raisins, and her relationship to race because of that. And then I have a prompt around like why I love blank food or why I hate blank food, and just like thinking of food and memory. And if you read my work, I write a lot about food, and what it does culturally. And so I think that food is always a really big one. Like find the big ways in and find the anchor poems that allow you to kind of just do a lot of big open-ended exercises. Don't grade poems. Don't, force young people to read poems. Do write your own poems as an instructor or as a facilitator. Do read them, especially if they're bad, right? Because it's kind of a bravery that young people don't get to see a lot of. We ask a lot of them, but we don't always demonstrate we're willing to be embarrassed or to not have a final form, presented to others. I don't know. Those are some really light suggestions.
I love that. I also love the food aspect. That's always a winner. Everybody can relate to food.
Of course.
Even when when I give examples in class, I always say, "Well, think of it as cheese," and then I start breaking it down as cheese.
That's right. Entirely. Yeah.
Maya is saying, it's always interesting to read books depicting my own culture, even if I'm only half Dominican. How much would you say your stories are influenced or inspired by your own Dominican culture and experiences?
I think that the many cultures I come from are characters of their own, and are always an influence on what's happening. And so Dominican culture, Afro-Dominican culture, New York, right, culture, growing up specifically right by Columbia University in Manhattan. And so one of the most affluent universities, and yet you're on the outskirts of it. So my relationship to money and wealth and academia, right? Like all of the things we come from affect what we write and affect how we read and what we think upbringing or a childhood deserves or lacked, right? And so it's huge for me, and I write a lot about Dominican mythology and folklore, and for me, the origin myth of the Dominican Republic as the first Spanish settlement, the first site of colonization, is something that is massive. It's massive in my imagination of what it means to have come from the first place that was a rupture on this side of the world that then led to an entire, right, like 180 of what this hemisphere knew, and how it existed and how it then for many civilizations stopped existing. And I think I have to write into the gaps of what I don't know. And Dominican history has been told from a very particular perspective for a long time. And so providing counter narratives, providing the stories that are passed down but were never written, imagining what my great-grandmother, my great-great-great-grandmother's grandmother would think or say or feel, like all of that feels like work that is healing, and is going against the impulses that still exist around folks who thought and think colonization was a good idea, right? And so yeah, Maya, it's everything. It's everything. Like
Mhm.
where I come from and who I come from, is the source, I think.
And all of what you just said, the history and the culture and kind of writing in the gaps, it's important that people are able to access literature that's representative of them in
Yeah.
any form. And Mally from Findlay Hancock County Public Library is saying, how do you respond to a school district that was considering pulling the Poet X? And I know that that's happened more than once, pulling the Poet X from the library and challenging teacher usage as a whole class text. I kind of feel like that's just a new extension of colonialism.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of really smart answers about our rights. There's a lot of smart answers about like how much money is wasted when people do book challenges, how many like, time of public servants is wasted.
Mhm.
And for me, I just always like, I don't even know what to respond. I often don't respond because I feel like they're just, what do we say at this point? I mean, if you're gonna pull Toni Morrison, like who are the rest of us, right? Like you've already on the side of like, don't care about art or literature or or any of the things.
Uh-huh.
But to me, it's like, what does it do to a young person who loves a book because it shows them in a light where they feel seen, for a school district to say, no, we're going to take this out? What does it do to that young person to feel erased in that way? What is it, especially if we're saying that the majority of young people's literature that's being banned or challenged has to do with characters of color or characters who are queer? And so if you're already marginalized in whatever environment you're in, and this is often coming from spaces where those identities are very, very marginalized, to then say, and we won't allow you to see yourself. Like to me, it just must be it's so lonely. And like, why would we want our kids to feel lonely?
Mhm.
I can't, my brain can't fathom it. And then also, like, if we taught critical thinking, we wouldn't have to worry about pulling books. And I trust that young people are really good critical thinkers, and they can read a book and not automatically believe everything that book has to say. I have young people who read the Poet X and they're like, I loved it, but I hated this, or I don't believe in this, or I think like they have their opinions. And so it's like, why don't we allow young people to read widely and see that there are a lot of differing ways to be in the world? And then from that, kind of borrow what they need to bolster who they want to be. And so I just think it does such a disservice to their minds, to who we think they like can be. And so I don't know. To me, it just doesn't. It's not about protecting young people, and then I have to remember that, right? So all of my responses are about like, but don't you care about the kids? And it's like, oh yeah, that's right. That's not what
That's not what
you're.
you're thinking about.
That's
Yeah.
not the point, right? And
Yeah.
so I'm sorry, I don't have a great answer to that
No,
because
that's okay.
I'm
That
just
was a great answer because you
fundamentally
also,
coming from a different place than the
yeah,
challengers, right?
exactly. And you also mentioned earlier, books are a way to not feel lonely. So,
Yeah,
like affecting the mental health in that aspect is also,
entirely. Yeah. Like I am alone in the world and also my county hates me. It's like,
yeah,
under the guise of protecting me. I don't know. It's just,
mm,
it's tough times,
it is, especially since we've seen kind of like a reversion. But anyway, we won't go there. Um,
Yeah.
so, do you think then that the industry has made any leaps and bounds toward greater representation in young adult literature?
I think that it's important to always remain very vigilant with any of the industries around um, sharing stories, because they're industries.
Mhm.
And so they're ultimately going to respond to what they think will be the thing that sells,
Mhm.
even if it's not always the thing that's right. And what I mean by that is, I think there was a big wave after 2014 and Walter D. Meyer's seminal piece about, the lack of writers of color and of stories written by people of color about characters of color. And so we saw this big wave of authors getting book deals and of getting a lot of support. And then we saw it kind of dwindle. And then 2020 happened. We saw this big wave in response to Black Lives Matter, and all of these editors and publishers put in place, and we're going to, really make the industry more representative of the community of readers. And now we've seen a lot of those editors be replaced, and a lot of those books dropped, or a lot of those books not getting support. And so we kind of see these big responses in moments where readers rise up and say, we need something different. And then the moment you're not in their face, we kind of see, and that's not everyone. I'm lucky to work with some incredible editors and incredible humans who really want to shape a different kind of literary world. But I think, you just have to remain really on it. There's always been waves. There's always waves of diversity and inclusion. And it's just like, how do we, and I do this because they've been called many things, right, in the past, but how do we guarantee second and third book deals, right? Like that not every author hits it out of the park on the first book, but that doesn't mean they don't have something important to say. How do we, create other paths for writers that doesn't just, you need a #1 bestseller or win every prize in order to be supported. And I think sometimes the expectations, because we're taking a chance on an author of color, is like, unless the gamble pays off immediately, you're not worth it. And I think that that kind of pressure doesn't make art.
Yeah.
So I don't know. And we can think about movies too. I think we're seeing that as well, right?
Yeah.
There's this big rise, and now,
True. It's definitely true. Kai from Stanislaus County Library says, from your personal experience, how can libraries do more to support you and your work?
Oh, I am just so lucky. Libraries have been fantastic. I can't say enough. I mean, I think what would be beautiful, what would make me super happy, if libraries just be really thoughtful about creating rich Caribbean literature sections. And so that the only time that someone is introduced to a work that talks about islands is not my work, and that they can see there's so many different kinds of depictions. So there's a lot of Dominicans and Dominicans Americans writing now, and I love when my book is in conversation with those other authors, so that we know there's not a single story. It's so many of us trying to tell all kinds of diverse stories, even from this tiny half of an island. And I love 2-person book clubs. And so I think as much as we can encourage parent-child book clubs, my books, when someone tells me like, I bought The Poet X for my mom and had her read it so we could talk about it, or I bought Family Lore for my niece, or these kind of two-way book clubs, I think was what I ached for growing up. Like, I just wish my mom would read the same books I would read so I could use it. So it could be something that I could use to talk, to say, oh, that passage was interesting, right? What did you think about what the mom said, right? Like, that it would be a facilitation. And so I think, I don't know how we could do that, but if we could package books as twosomes, in, here's in Spanish, here's in English, like you and your kids should read it, and we have a question guide or something. I just think that, there's a lot of ways to kind of makes the book something that can be utilized. I keep saying the same thing, but it's just, there's a book as entertainment, and then there's the book as something useful.
Yes.
And to me, the latter, whenever I get that compliment of like, I was able to use it to navigate a relationship, it just feels like, what's the point if not that, right?
I love that you said that, the 2-person book club, because we did have a question earlier that I wasn't able to get to about how, not only how do we teach like young adults, but how do we use young adult literature to teach parents and adults? So that's a great idea. That's how you do it. 2-person book club. Okay, so the question that I always love to close with, and Jen from Valley Cottage Library beat me to it. Jen says, as a teacher, I always like asking authors, what's the last book that you totally geeked out about? What are you dying to get your hands on next that everybody should run out to the library and check out immediately? I know you gave us a lot of books that inspire you, but what are you going with currently?
Oh, the last book I geeked out about is the essayist and poet Ross Gay, his collection Inciting Joy. And that's the book I've just been like handing out to everybody. Like that is my ministry. Just like we should all be reading Ross Gay. And I have Tom Lake on audiobook right now, and I'm going on vacation this week. And so I will be listening to Meryl Streep read to me about Tom Lake. And so I think that's what I'm excited about. I'm reading a lot of adult these days, and I'm working within that space. So I don't have a good YA rec right now, but those are two that I'm sitting with.
That's okay. Those are great recommendations. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank
I hope you enjoy your vacation.
Thank you.
It's been such a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for sharing your story with us and your brilliant work. I truly do appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Be well, y'all. Take care.
I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning into our author talk today. Without your support, none of this would be possible. As a reminder, if you scroll down below the live stream video, you can see the resources area, which contains a link to Elizabeth's books. We look forward to seeing you all again on July 30th when we chat with best-selling author and National Book Award winner Dan Santat about his book, A First Time for Everything, which is a graphic memoir based on his own awkward middle school years and the trip to Europe that changed his life. I'm Brandon Adler, and thank you for joining us.